The cameras were rolling, the studio lights hot and unflinching, when Kellyanne Conway leaned forward, her voice cutting across the host like a blade. She wasn't speaking anymore, she was shouting. Words tumbled out rapid and sharp, each one laced with contempt. Her hands carved the air, jabbing, slicing, trying to dominate the screen as she drowned out every other voice in the room. The anchor tried to regain control, but Conway pushed harder, her tone rising, her face flushed with the strain of a rage she could no longer disguise. It wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a spectacle. Millions of Americans were watching live, glued to their screens, wondering how far she would go, how much venom she would pour into that moment. This was Kellyanne Conway at her most unrestrained, the embodiment of arrogance on display, and there in stark contrast sat Jasmine Crockett. Not moving, not flinching, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't match Conway's fury with fury of her own. Instead, she held her posture steady, her gaze sharp yet composed, her silence cutting deeper than Conway's volume ever could. It was the kind of composure that made the tension unbearable, because the audience knew, everyone watching knew, that silence like that wasn't weakness. It was preparation. The scene played out like a high-stakes drama, as if the entire nation had paused to take a breath. The anchor shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. Kellyanne's words spilled over themselves, but they were beginning to sound less like conviction and more like desperation. And Jasmine still hadn't spoken. In living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their televisions, waiting, anticipating. Social media feeds lit up with stunned reactions. What's happening right now? Is Jasmine going to answer? This is about to go viral. And then, in that electrifying silence, as Kellyanne's tirade finally reached its boiling point, Jasmine drew a quiet breath. She tilted her head ever so slightly, a gesture of calm against the storm, and prepared to speak. The world didn't know it yet, but what came out of her mouth next would stop Kellyanne in her tracks, send shockwaves across the internet, and ignite a conversation far larger than the shouting match on that stage. Because sometimes the loudest voice in the room isn't the one screaming. It's the one that waits, steady and unshaken, for the perfect moment to reply. And that moment had just arrived. The setting was primetime, one of those televised political segments where millions of viewers tuned in not only for the news but for the drama. The network had promoted it heavily, two powerful voices, one from the old guard of political spin and one from the new wave of truth-telling leadership. The topic on the table was supposed to be policy, economic fairness, the struggles of everyday families, but almost immediately, it turned into something else. The host introduced the guests with the usual practiced rhythm, but the tension was thick from the very first exchange. Kellyanne Conway, seasoned in the art of combative television, leaned into the performance as though it were her natural state. To her, this wasn't about truth or clarity. It was about dominance. She wielded volume as a weapon, her interruptions strategically designed to overwhelm, her sharp retorts crafted less to inform and more to intimidate. But there was more at stake than just another fairy debate on cable news. In that moment, the clash became symbolic of something larger, something that stretched far beyond the studio walls. It wasn't merely Conway against Crockett. It was arrogance against dignity. It was the old politics of shouting down the opposition versus the emerging insistence on calm strength and steady conviction. Every time Conway raised her voice, she embodied a culture that had long relied on intimidation to win. And every time Jasmine sat quietly, refusing to be dragged into the chaos, she was sending a message. America is hungry for something better. The audience could feel it. On couches and in kitchens, ordinary viewers who had grown weary of the noise recognized the stakes. This wasn't just about policy bullet points. It was about the future tone of our national conversations. Were Americans destined to live in a constant storm of outrage? Or could dignity, composure, and integrity hold their ground, even in the face of unrelenting hostility? Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another guest sitting across from Kellyanne Conway. She was a rising voice, one whose life story carried the weight of sacrifice, service, and struggle. That calm expression on her face was not born of naivete. It was forged in a world that had underestimated her again and again, only to be proven wrong. Her resilience wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, sharpened by battles most people never saw. And that was what Conway didn't understand. To her, this was just another night, another sparring match where volume might win the day. But the woman she was shouting at wasn't there to play the same old game. Jasmine knew who she was. She knew what she represented. And she understood the power of restraint in a world that had grown numb to noise. As the cameras lingered on Conway's heated tirade, as her hands flew through the air and her words blurred into fury, the contrast became undeniable. One figure looked desperate to be heard. The other radiated a calm that demanded respect without ever asking for it. The longer it went on, the clearer it became that this wasn't a clash of equals. It was a test. A test of whether arrogance could still silence dignity, or whether dignity could finally rise above the noise. The viewers didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness something unforgettable. Conway thought she was steamrolling another opponent, playing the role she had played 100 times before. But what she didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett's reply would not just be a rebuttal. It would be a reckoning. Because Kellyanne Conway had no idea who she was really up against. To understand what unfolded on that stage, you have to understand Kellyanne Conway, not just the moment, but the years of patterns that led to it. Kellyanne wasn't new to political combat. She had built her entire career on it. From the early days as a pollster who massaged numbers to fit her clients' needs, to the high-profile role she carved out as counselor to the president, Conway became synonymous with one thing: the art of spin. She didn't just debate, she bulldozed. She didn't just argue. She rewrote reality in real time, leaving opponents scrambling to catch up. It was Kellyanne who coined the phrase alternative facts, a term that instantly revealed her talent for transforming lies into weapons. To some, it was clever wordplay. To others, it was a chilling admission that truth had become negotiable. And in Conway's world, it often was. Time and again, she walked into interviews where the facts were against her, and instead of conceding, she would double down, distract, pivot, and overwhelm. The goal wasn't to win with reason. It was to win with sheer force of personality. Her style became a kind of trademark: the sharp interruptions, the smirk that suggested superiority, the way she could dismiss legitimate criticism with a wave of her hand or a sarcastic quip. She had a knack for making her opponents look rattled, not because they didn't have a case, but because they were unprepared for someone who treated truth like clay to be molded. But beneath that polished performance was something darker. Conway thrived on chaos. She wielded gaslighting as a political tool, convincing audiences that what they saw with their own eyes wasn't really happening, that their memory of events was flawed, that she alone could decode reality. In doing so, she left countless Americans frustrated, exhausted, and disillusioned with a system that seemed to reward arrogance over honesty. The controversies stacked up. There was the infamous endorsement of a fashion line from the White House briefing room, blurring the lines between governance and self-promotion. There were interviews where she casually dismissed ethical concerns or redefined basic principles to defend the indefensible. Time after time, she managed to turn what should have been scandal into spectacle, slipping past accountability with the same grin and sharp tongue that had become her armor. Her combativeness wasn't just about policy or ideology, it was personal. She took debates as arenas for domination, not dialogue. The louder she spoke, the more space she claimed. And in an America that had grown wary of shouting, that style came to represent something far bigger than Kellyanne herself. It became a symbol of the arrogance of power, the entitlement of those who thought they could bend reality to their will. For many viewers, she was more than a political figure. She was the face of a culture that dismissed critics as weak, that mocked truth as optional, that replaced respect with ridicule. Every outburst, every sidestep, every smirk was another reminder of how far political discourse had fallen. And yet, there was always a vulnerability hidden behind that bluster. For all her skill in the arena of words, Conway's approach carried a fatal flaw: it relied on others being flustered, intimidated, or silenced. Her victories depended on chaos, and when confronted by someone who refused to be rattled, her power began to unravel. That was the dynamic playing out on live television. Conway entered the debate convinced she could do what she had always done: dominate the stage, shout her opponent into submission, and walk away victorious. But she had underestimated the woman across from her. Jasmine Crockett was not an easy target. She was not another anchor to be talked over, nor another opponent to be worn down. She was calm, deliberate, and unshakable. And that calm exposed every crack in Conway's performance. In the seconds that Conway spent raising her voice, gesturing wildly, and trying to seize control, viewers could see the old playbook unfolding. They had seen it before: the gaslighting, the arrogance, the desperate attempt to make noise louder than truth. But this time, something was different. The audience wasn't leaning in to marvel at Conway's audacity. They were watching, waiting, for the woman on the other side of the screen to answer. And Jasmine's silence, her refusal to engage in the chaos, was making Conway's tactics look less like dominance and more like desperation. What had once been her greatest strength now risked exposing her weakness. Kellyanne Conway had spent years turning arrogance into a weapon. She had built her reputation on bending reality, on forcing opponents into corners where logic and truth couldn't save them. But arrogance, when unchecked, always carries the seeds of its own downfall. And tonight, live on television, that very arrogance would backfire. Long before she was trending on social media, long before her name flashed across headlines for standing her ground on live television, Jasmine Crockett's story began in a place that could not be more different from the polished lights of a news studio. She grew up in modest surroundings, far from the elite corridors of Washington, in communities where struggle wasn't an abstract idea but an everyday reality. From an early age, she learned what it meant to fight for space, to fight to be heard, and to fight for others who had no voice. Her first battles weren't waged with microphones and cameras. They were in courtrooms and neighborhood meetings, in conversations with families who had been overlooked, underrepresented, or outright dismissed by the system. As a public defender, Crockett faced the raw edge of American injustice head-on. She represented clients who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys, people who were routinely underestimated, people who had been told by society that they didn't matter. For Jasmine, every case was personal because every client was a reminder of the America that still needed fixing. Those years hardened her resolve but also shaped her demeanor. Where others might have grown bitter, she grew sharper. Where others might have burned out, she leaned in. And when doors closed in her face, she found ways to push them open. Not by raising her voice louder than anyone else in the room, but by refusing to move until she was heard. That refusal to yield became a signature trait. Jasmine Crockett didn't need arrogance to stand tall. She carried herself with a quiet authenticity that was rare in politics, a humility rooted in lived experience. It was this humility that made her relatable, and this authenticity that made her dangerous to those who thrived on spin. When she transitioned from the courtroom to the political arena, many underestimated her again. Critics whispered that she was too new, too unpolished, too unwilling to play by the rules of political theater. They mistook her plain-spoken honesty for inexperience. They assumed she could be dismissed as easily as countless others who had tried and failed to challenge the status quo. But time after time, she proved them wrong. Her campaign was fueled not by corporate money or elite connections, but by grassroots energy. Volunteers who believed in her vision knocked on doors, shared her message, and told their neighbors that this was a woman worth fighting for. She wasn't a polished insider promising half measures. She was one of them, willing to take their struggles to the highest halls of power. That energy carried her into Congress, where she quickly made a name for herself, not by shouting the loudest, but by asking the questions that mattered most, and by refusing to be intimidated by those who thought power was theirs alone to wield. Yet the underestimation never stopped. On Capitol Hill, surrounded by veterans of political spin, she was again dismissed as a newcomer who would eventually learn her place. But Jasmine's place was never at the margins. Every time she spoke up, every time she pressed for accountability, she reminded the establishment that authenticity cannot be silenced forever. It was this history, this relentless journey from overlooked beginnings to a rising national voice, that she carried with her into that studio the night she sat across from Kellyanne Conway. And it was why she did not flinch when Conway tried to overwhelm her with volume and arrogance. To Jasmine, being shouted at wasn't new. Dismissal wasn't new. Underestimation wasn't new. She had faced it all before, from courtrooms to campaigns, from those in power who thought silence could be forced upon her. What made Jasmine different was that she never mistook composure for weakness. She knew the strength it took to remain calm under pressure, to hold your ground without losing your dignity. Where Conway wielded arrogance like a sword, Jasmine carried humility like a shield, and that humility, rooted in truth, was stronger than any spin. As she sat there listening without interruption, waiting for her moment, Jasmine was not just a congresswoman facing down a political adversary. She was the embodiment of a much larger story, the story of those who had been told they didn't belong, those who had been silenced, those who had fought uphill battles simply to be heard. Her presence alone was a reminder that America's future wasn't defined by who could yell the loudest, but by who could stand tallest in the storm. The contrast was striking. On one side, Kellyanne Conway, polished in the art of gaslighting, confident that her voice alone could carry the day. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, steady, calm, and deliberate, unwilling to be dragged into the noise. One relied on bluster, the other relied on truth. One sought dominance, the other embodied dignity. And for millions of viewers watching at home, that contrast mattered. It wasn't just about what was said, but about what was represented. Conway represented the old politics of arrogance and intimidation. Crockett represented something new, the possibility of an America where authenticity and composure could cut through chaos. That was the story the cameras captured in those tense minutes. The story of two women, two styles, two Americas colliding on live television. And though Conway had the louder voice, Jasmine Crockett had the deeper power. Because when she finally chose to speak, her words would carry the weight of everything she had lived through, everything she had fought for, and everything she stood for. And it was that unshakable composure that would soon rewrite the headlines. The debate reached its boiling point almost instantly. as if the air itself had been waiting for the spark. The split screen told the whole story. On one side, Kellyanne Conway leaned forward, eyes blazing, voice rising with every word, her hands slicing the air as if she could physically cut off Jasmine's response. On the other side, Jasmine Crockett sat back, her expression still and measured, the very picture of composure. The host tried to intervene, his voice cracking under the strain of authority slipping through his fingers. "Let's let Congresswoman Crockett finish her point." But Kellyanne plowed ahead, her tone sharp, her words tumbling one over another in a torrent of accusations. She wasn't debating anymore. She was cornering, circling like a predator that had mistaken its prey for something weaker. The audience could feel it through the screen. That familiar discomfort of watching a conversation collapse into chaos, the frustration of hearing someone bulldoze through the rules of civility. Kellyanne's voice dominated, filling the airwaves with sheer volume, her interruptions relentless. Each time Jasmine moved her lips to respond, Kellyanne's sharper, louder tone cut across, leaving no room for dialogue. And yet Jasmine did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to compete, did not meet the arrogance with anger. She let Kellyanne have the noise. She let her have the spectacle. She sat still, her silence like a steady current beneath Conway's storm. Every camera caught the contrast. Kellyanne's red face and frantic gestures on one side of the screen, Jasmine's composed stillness on the other. It was not a debate anymore. It was a study in opposites. The tension only grew as Kellyanne doubled down. She spoke over the host, waved away the anchor's plea for order, and launched into a tirade so forceful that even her supporters watching at home shifted uncomfortably. It was supposed to be strength, but it was reading as desperation. She leaned further and further into the attack, her voice nearly breaking, her hands clutching at control that was slipping away by the second. And all the while, Jasmine's eyes never wavered. She watched. She waited. Not with disdain but with a kind of patience that unsettled Kellyanne more than any insult could. Viewers could see it, that strange, magnetic power of calmness in the face of rage. It was the kind of composure that said, "I've seen worse than this. You can't shake me." The studio itself seemed caught in the grip of suspense. The host's attempts to restore balance had failed. Kellyanne's voice filled the room, but there was an undercurrent, something unspoken, something gathering just beyond the noise. Because audiences everywhere were beginning to realize this couldn't last forever. At some point, Jasmine Crockett was going to respond. And that thought, what she might say, how she might say it, was what kept millions of viewers frozen in their seats. On social media, clips of the escalating tirade were already circulating, but the captions were all the same. "Wait until you hear Jasmine's reply." It was the silence that made the difference. Every second Jasmine didn't respond, every pause she held magnified the expectation. She wasn't losing the debate by staying quiet. She was controlling it. She was building a moment, one that everyone watching could feel but no one could predict. Finally, as Kellyanne's voice reached its peak, breaking into a sharp crescendo of anger, Jasmine leaned forward slightly. It was almost imperceptible, a shift in posture, a signal that she was ready to speak. And in that small, deliberate gesture, the energy in the room shifted. The shouting continued, the interruptions piled up, the anchor looked ready to surrender entirely. But Jasmine had chosen her moment, and as she parted her lips to speak, millions of viewers leaned forward, phones in hand, hearts pounding in anticipation. Because everyone sensed what was about to happen. They didn't know the words yet, but they knew the tone, the weight, the impact. It was building toward something unforgettable. And then, in one single reply, everything shifted. For a moment, the studio froze. Kellyanne's voice still ricocheted off the walls, but it was already fading in the minds of those watching. What lingered instead was the silence, a silence owned, commanded, stretched out deliberately by Jasmine Crockett. She had been patient, weathering the storm without so much as a blink, and now, with every eye fixed on her, she exhaled slowly, tilted her head just enough to register composure, and began. "Are you finished?" she asked softly. The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they landed like thunder. The air seemed to rush out of the room. Conway blinked, her mouth half open, caught in the stillness of a tone that refused to fight on her terms. For the first time that evening, the noise stopped. Jasmine leaned forward. Her voice was even, calm, unshaken. "See, this is the difference between the two of us. You think volume equals truth. You think yelling makes you strong. But the truth doesn't need to shout. It stands on its own." The studio audience let out an audible gasp, and the host froze in his chair, hands hovering uselessly over his papers. Conway stammered, trying to interject, but Jasmine didn't pause for her. She continued, measured and firm, her eyes locked on Conway. "I represent people who don't get the luxury of yelling their way out of accountability. I represent families who don't have time for spin because they're too busy trying to survive. And while you sit here turning every question into a circus, those families are the ones who pay the price for your games. The weight of her words cut through the air like a blade. Twitter exploded. Within seconds, clips of her opening lines were being clipped, captioned, and shared. Jasmine Crockett just ended Kellyanne with FFTS. This is the energy we need. The hashtags began to form, climbing with every passing second. Conway's composure cracked. She laughed, the kind of nervous laugh meant to brush off an attack, but it sounded hollow. "Oh, please," she muttered, waving her hand as if swatting away an insect. But the audience wasn't buying it. The camera caught her shifting in her chair, adjusting her posture, suddenly less certain of her dominance. Jasmine pressed on, her tone steady. "You've made a career out of bending truth into whatever shape suits you. You've told people to ignore their own eyes, their own memories, their own common sense, and maybe that worked for a while. Maybe it kept you on TV. But let me be clear, America is tired. They don't need more spin. They don't need more shouting. They need someone who actually listens." The anchor's jaw visibly tightened. He knew, as did everyone in that studio, that something bigger than an exchange of talking points was happening. This wasn't just a counter-argument, it was a turning point. Conway tried again to interrupt, her voice strained now. That's not what this is about, Congresswoman." But Jasmine didn't yield. She raised a single hand, not to silence Conway rudely, but to reclaim the space she had earned. "No, you've had your turn to scream. Now you're going to hear me." The room fell dead silent. The cameras zoomed in. The moment was unmistakable. Power had shifted. And then came the line, the one destined to replay on millions of screens. Jasmine said it calmly, without theatrics, without venom. "I don't need to shout you, Kellyanne, because when the dust settles, history won't remember who screamed the loudest. It will remember who stood with the truth." The crowd reaction was instant. Gasps, murmurs, the faint sound of applause from the studio floor. Social media lit up like wildfire, tweets multiplied by the thousands. That's the quote. That's the moment. Clips were edited with captions. "Calm destroys chaos." Within minutes, her words were trending nationwide. Conway's face betrayed her. The forced smile slipped, her eyes darted toward the host as if begging for rescue. But the host had no rescue to offer. He was still too stunned, still processing the shift he'd just witnessed. For the first time in the debate, Kellyanne Conway looked small. Jasmine, meanwhile, leaned back, her point delivered with surgical precision. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to twist the knife. The silence that followed was enough. It wasn't just a reply. It was a statement. A mirror held up to arrogance, showing it for what it was. The clip raced across TikTok, where creators stitched it with captions like, "This is how you handle a bully." On Instagram, it appeared with dramatic background music, labeled as "the mic drop heard around the world." Commentators on X wrote threads unpacking why Jasmine's restraint carried more force than any shouting match ever could. Even celebrities chimed in. A well-known actor tweeted, "We don't need more chaos. We need more Jasmines." A civil rights leader posted the clip with the caption, "This is what dignity looks like under fire." The reaction wasn't just political. It was cultural, generational. People saw in Jasmine's calm a reflection of what they wished for in themselves, the power to stay steady when confronted with chaos. Meanwhile, Kellyanne scrambled. She tried to recover with sarcasm, muttering about performances and media darlings. But it only deepened the contrast. The louder she tried to claw back attention, the clearer it became that she had lost control of the narrative. The viral clip wasn't hers to claim. It belonged to Jasmine. And as the debate wound down, as the final minutes ticked away, viewers weren't talking about policy points or partisan victories. They were talking about a moment of clarity, a moment when dignity stood tall against arrogance and won. It was the moment when a calm, steady voice cut through the shouting and showed the nation that truth doesn't need to scream. It was the moment when Jasmine Crockett's story leapt from the margins to the mainstream, carried not on noise, but on the strength of composure. And while Kellyanne Conway sat fuming in the wreckage of her own performance, the rest of the country knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Because sometimes, the loudest mic drop isn't a shout, it's the silence that comes after a truth too powerful to ignore. The cameras went dark, but the moment was only just beginning. Before the debate even wrapped, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's reply had already leapt onto social media. Someone in the control room leaked it within seconds, and by the time the credits rolled, the internet was ablaze. Within minutes, millions were replaying the clip. On X, the hashtag #CalmCrushesChaos trended globally, pushed by thousands of retweets. Memes flooded Instagram, split-screen images of Kellyanne's furious shouting paired with Jasmine's serene expression, captioned, "Energy we all need." TikTok stitched Jasmine's line, "History won't remember who screamed the loudest," with music ranging from gospel choirs to rap beats. Comment sections erupted. "This is how you handle a bully." Jasmine just became a household name. Kellyanne met her match, and she lost. The virality was undeniable. People who hadn't tuned into the debate suddenly felt like they had, because the moment was everywhere. On phones, on laptops, on TVs playing inside bars and living rooms across the country. By the next morning, cable news anchors were replaying the clip with breathless analysis. Some called it the debate's defining moment. Others labeled it a generational shift in political discourse. And on late-night shows, comedians found endless material. Kellyanne tried to scream her way through another debate, but Jasmine Crockett hit her with the verbal equivalent of a noise-canceling headphone. The joke landed, but beneath the laughter was a serious recognition. Jasmine had not just survived the exchange, she had emerged as its undeniable victor. The shockwaves went further than comedy and memes. Prominent political commentators weighed in. One conservative pundit admitted grudgingly, Conway lost her composure. Crockett owned the moment. A progressive columnist declared, this wasn't about party lines. It was about dignity versus chaos, and dignity won. The framing was no longer partisan, it was cultural. Supporters rallied. Jasmine's campaign donations surged overnight, small dollar contributions pouring in from people who had never heard her name until that evening. A grassroots movement began forming in real time, digital communities branding themselves Team Jasmine and pledging to amplify her voice. She was no longer just a congresswoman from Texas. She was a rising national figure. Kellyanne's allies tried damage control. Spokespeople dismissed Jasmine's reply as scripted theater, but the defense fell flat. The more they spoke, the more obvious it became Conway's outburst had backfired. Her strategy of dominance had created the perfect stage for Jasmine's calm to shine. Meanwhile, the cultural resonance deepened. Editorials appeared with headlines like, "Why We're Tired of Shouting," and "Jasmine Crockett's Calm is the Future of Politics." A psychologist on morning TV broke it down. What people saw wasn't just a political exchange. It was an emotional contrast. One person panicked, the other stayed grounded. That's what made it viral. The ripple effect reached beyond politics. Educators began showing the clip in classrooms as an example of composure under pressure. Business leaders cited it in talks about negotiation tactics. Even parenting blogs referenced Jasmine's demeanor, praising the lesson of not feeding chaos with chaos. And through it all, Jasmine herself stayed composed. She tweeted once that night, "Truth doesn't need to scream. Grateful for the love. Let's get back to work." Just a dozen words, but they racked up hundreds of thousands of likes. It was the restraint that resonated. But beyond the memes, beyond the applause, beyond the hashtags and trending soundtracks, something deeper was happening. This wasn't just about Kellyanne Conway losing her temper or Jasmine Crockett winning a debate clip. It was about the hunger of an audience, of a nation, for a new way of seeing leadership. And while the world laughed at the memes and replayed the moment for entertainment, the undercurrent carried something more profound, a shift in expectations, a yearning for politics that traded chaos for clarity. The cliffhanger was no longer whether Jasmine Crockett had gone viral. She had. The real question was, what would she do with this new platform, this sudden national spotlight, and what did it mean for those who had built their entire power on shouting the loudest? Because the memes were just the surface. Beneath them, a movement was starting to stir. The clip may have gone viral, but the power of Jasmine Crockett's moment wasn't just in the views, the memes, or the trending hashtags. It was in the values it crystallized. What unfolded on that debate stage was more than a clash of personalities. It was a clash of philosophies. One side believed volume could drown out truth. The other side, Jasmine's side, showed that dignity could silence chaos without raising its voice. Her composure became the moral of the story. By refusing to match Kellyanne Conway's shouting with more shouting, Jasmine revealed something many Americans have quietly longed for: leadership that doesn't need to dominate to be strong, that doesn't need to humiliate to be respected. It was a living demonstration that truth doesn't require theatrics, it requires steadiness. And for women of color in politics, the symbolism cut even deeper. For generations, black women have been told they were too loud, too angry, too much. They've been dismissed, doubted, and caricatured, forced to fight stereotypes at every turn. Jasmine turned that prejudice on its head. In the face of a white woman shouting at her on national television, she stayed calm, steady, unshaken, and in doing so, she exposed the lie that strength must be wrapped in anger. Her strength was measured, deliberate, unflinching. That's why the moment resonated far beyond politics. It was about every immigrant who's been spoken over in a boardroom, every working-class mother who's had her voice ignored, every young activist told to wait their turn. Jasmine Crockett stood as proof that you don't have to bend to arrogance, and you don't have to match hostility to be heard. You just have to hold your ground in truth, America, wary from years of polarized shouting matches, recognized something refreshing in that. A hunger for authenticity rose to the surface. Voters aren't just looking for policy proposals, they're looking for proof of character. They're craving leaders who can reflect the values they want to live by. Calm, courage, resilience. Jasmine's reply didn't just earn applause. It reminded people that politics, at its best, is supposed to model the civility we wish to see in ourselves. The lesson is universal. Dignity is not weakness, calm is not surrender, and truth, even when spoken softly, carries more weight than 1,000 screams. In fact, it is often the calmest voice in the storm that redefines the battlefield. As the noise of the news cycle churned on, Jasmine's moment remained. Commentators could spin it, opponents could downplay it, but millions of Americans had already felt the shift. They saw that the future of discourse didn't belong to those who yelled the loudest. It belonged to those who could stand unshaken in the face of the yelling. And that is the resolution. This story offers a new definition of power. Not the power to dominate or belittle, but the power to remain whole when others unravel. Not the power to win the noise, but to remind the nation what leadership looks like when stripped of theatrics. In the end, Jasmine Crockett gave us a simple truth to carry forward in a world loud with anger. Calm truth can shake the ground, and maybe, just maybe, it can reshape the way we see politics and the way we see ourselves. And so we return to where it all began. The viral moment that lit up America's screens. Kellyanne Conway shouting, hands flailing, desperate to control the stage. And Jasmine Crockett, calm and unshaken, delivering a reply so steady it cut sharper than any scream. The clip went viral not just because it was entertaining, but because it revealed something fundamental. In the battle between arrogance and dignity, dignity wins. Every time. That's why this moment matters. It's not just about one debate, one headline, or one trending hashtag. It's about a lesson America is yearning to relearn. That true strength doesn't come from domination, but from restraint. That the leaders we need aren't the ones who yell the loudest, but the ones who can look anger in the face and answer with composure, clarity, and truth. So here's the call. If you believe voices like Jasmine's deserve to be amplified, if you believe dignity should define our politics, then don't let this story stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Make sure the calm voice that silenced arrogance on live television is heard in every corner of this country. And if you want more stories that remind us of who we can be at our best, subscribe and stand with us. Because this isn't just content, it's a movement. Because in the end, politics is more than theater. It's a reflection of what we value. And sometimes, as Jasmine Crockett proved on that unforgettable night, the calmest voice is the loudest one.